Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another March Madness webinar from MMGA. Tonight, we're going to be hearing from Melanie Mannion, who's going to give a great presentation about native trees and shrubs. Remember that if you have questions, to enter it in the question and answer box, and we will be addressing those at the end of the webinar. I would like to introduce Ruth Steele Walker, who's co-treasurer of MMGA, Vicki Lauren, who is our secretary, Norm Scheer, who's president of MMGA. I'm Sue Augard, I'm vice president and co-treasurer. And tonight I would like to introduce Jenny Wanty, who will be introducing our guest speaker. Jenny served as the MSU Master Naturalist Coordinator and worked in the Kent County MSU Horticulture Department for 13 years. She also serves on the West Michigan Conservation Network Board and works closely with Kent and Montcalm Conservation Districts. Jenny, take it away.
Thank you. I am just so pleased and thrilled to introduce Melanie Mannion, who is just one amazing individual. I was lucky enough to meet her. It was kind of cosmic, I think, at Blandford Nature Center, her first job. And I had just moved back to Grand Rapids after my brain tumor. And there she was. And the rest is just kind of history, what we put together. So Melanie is currently the Natural Resource Manager for Ottawa County Parks and Rec. She oversees the stewardship and restoration of over 7,000 acres in parks and open space in Ottawa County. She also runs a comprehensive volunteer program, which includes goats eating invasive species, which is one of everybody's favorite things to go see and pet because they're so darn cute. And she's also started a program with putting wild rice back in the Grand River along with some Native Americans. Pretty cool. Previously, Melanie was worked for the Land Conservancy of West Michigan and Blandford Nature Center. She was the founder of the West Michigan Conservation Network, as I like to describe her. Without her, we would not be where we are today. And additionally, she helped me create the Master Naturalist program in Ottawa County. And she taught both the native tree and shrub class and invasives for Master Naturalists. So without further ado, the wonderful Melanie Mannion.
If I wasn't already red enough for my sunburn, Jenny, thank you so much. And thank you all for coming tonight and giving your evening to talk about trees and shrubs. I always like to say that this is one of the hardest of all of my presentations because so many people know trees and shrubs. It's one, unfortunately, that I did not know in the very beginning. In fact, when I first started out as a naturalist, actually before I was a naturalist, I didn't even know when I was in college that acorns turned into oak trees. So I started at the very bottom. So a lot of times when people say, I don't know if I'll ever learn, I always say you could not have gotten lower than where I was when I began my journey. And now today, I can tell you every tree that is out in our forest and most of the shrubs, not all of them, but most of them. And so I've come a long way and you will as well. So hopefully today, some of it might be a refresher, but I hope I am able to share a couple new things with you too along the way. So without going any further, all right. So hopefully everybody can see my screen correctly. I'm going to try to fix one thing on my computer before I get going. I am not the most computer savvy of people. I will just tell everyone that. I'd much rather, as Sue said, be out in the woods than being behind a computer, but hopefully I can figure this out. Let me try one last thing. I'm just having a hard time seeing my chat disappeared. Oh, well, I know that Sue said that the board will help answer some of those chats and give me some of those questions later on tonight. So I want to start off by explaining what we're going to, where our path is going to lead us through today. So we'll start off talking about some processes of how to identify. Some of these are going to be really big concepts, and then we'll come down to some of the real basics of how to identify a plant. Then we'll go into some of the all-stars, some of my favorites. I know someone has already asked about sandy, shady understory trees. So I'll share some of my favorite species, and then hopefully answer some of your questions too if you have a particular request. And then we'll go into some of the troublemakers, some of the trees and shrubs and vines that we are concerned about, just a few of those. And finally, we'll end the evening talking about the threats to our forest and to specifically our trees. So we'll start off talking about, just the very basics. And that is, when we're talking about dendrology, we're talking about all the things that have woody tissue in them. And so it may seem simple, right? Like this beech tree seems pretty simple that it's a tree, but there are some species that get a little questionable. And so a tree, by very definition, means that it has one or two single trunks that take it up. There are small trees and there are large trees, but there are actually some things that are considered as small tree or shrub, and it can kind of go in between depending on the number of main stems that it has. And so when you get out there, it can get kind of tricky once you get past something as simple as this beech tree. It can also get tricky because you might be looking at something and not even know that it's woody. Something as beautiful as this lead plant may seem like it's just a beautiful wildflower, but when you actually look close, you realize that the stem is woody. And so therefore it actually is classified as a woody species, as a shrub, because it has woody material and it's also multi-stemmed. And then the final classification that you'll find in your identification books are vines. And vines are anything that is woody that can't support itself. It needs to grow on another structure, whether it be a tree or a fence or your house, etc. So once you now know what kind of woody species you have, now you are going to want to figure out what kind of environment it grows in. Some things to consider when you're talking about its habitat. So the first one, and probably one of the most important, is light. Is it shade intolerant, meaning it can only grow in full sun, or is it shade tolerant? And these are really important, not only when you're talking about things you want to put into your yard, but also just helping you identify it when you're out, if it's in the woods or if it's growing in an open area. Soil moisture, we call those xeric is dry, mesic is moist, but not overly moist. And then of course you have the hydric soils or your wetland soils. Then you have soil type. We can grow in clay, sandy, loam, anything in between. Succession is a really important one when you're looking at a tree species. Some things are early succession, meaning you've had this disturbance, it's open. What is going to come in first? And then there are those that are your climax species, things like hemlock trees and beech trees and maple trees. Those are going to come in later in succession. Also, amount of disturbance. How much disturbance can this species have? If it's something that can tolerate a lot of disturbance, or then it's going to grow into an area that has, a lot of people, a lot of disturbance, or some that just can't tolerate that and will not be able to exist. And finally, and this is my favorite part because I am a detective. Growing up, I always like to tell people my favorite show was Murder, She Wrote. I loved mysteries, and it's because I love the clues that lead you to the answer at the end. And my favorite thing is for my brain to be putting those clues together. And that's what the associates is. You can have all those different things above that, but really what makes it fun and being a naturalist is being able to look at something and look at its surrounding landscape and then figuring out what it is. And I always I started thinking about this because I have young children now, and my daughters started reading, and they started talking about the context. They'll get an unknown word and they can look at all the surrounding words to figure out what it is. And that's what I do when I'm looking at a tree. I might look at a tree and go, I really don't know what you are. But if I figure out the ones that are around it, it's a problem solving and saying, oh, that's what you are. Now I know. So the next step, once you kind of are looking at the habitat or where this thing is growing, is before that step is really looking at the big picture and really looking at what part of Michigan it's growing. So we have these big things, which we call biomes, and there are only two biomes in Michigan. There's the boreal, which is the northern biome, and then there's the temperate deciduous, which is the lower biome. And then once you get down to there, you can go a little more detailed and get into the communities. Now, my favorite book, if you're looking for a good book, is Barnes and Wagner's Michigan Trees. It has a lot of great details, but it has a great job of telling you what community you're going to find this particular tree in. Again, the associates, what is it going to be associated with? But of course, if you don't want to go get a book, or you already have Barnes and Wagner and want something a little bit more extensive, Michigan Natural Features Inventory is where I go every time now, because oftentimes especially when I'm doing a restoration and I want to plant associates, I might have a starter tree that I want to start my planting with, but I want to look at what it would naturally fit with. And so you can go into these communities, these plant communities, to figure out what else would be associated with that. So the fun thing about Michigan is that, especially if you're living here in central Michigan, whether that be here in Ottawa County, Kent County, all the way over to Saginaw, that stretch is what we call the tension zone. And the great thing about the tension zone is it's where the northern species meet the southern species, and you get them overlapping. And so this dark line right in the middle is the tension zone. Now with climate change, it's moving around a little bit, right? So this is in 1979. But those trees haven't moved very much since then, unless they've been facilitated by people. So this tension zone is really important because this is our most biodiverse area, because it has both of those species, both of those biomes combined. And then the further south you go from that line, the less northern species you have and the more southern species you're going to have as a component of your forest. And the same goes for the north. So the more north you get, the more boreal species you're going to have and the less southern species you're going to have. And these ISO lines, these are the amount of change. And you can see it's not a direct line across the state. It is kind of this wavy line. So this is an example of something that you would find on Michigan Natural Features Inventory's plant communities. So again, this is really simple. You just Google Michigan Natural Features Inventory. You go into the tab that says Plant Communities, and there's a whole list of them. And I chose the one that is Mesic Southern Forest. This is one that's very common in my region here in Ottawa County and Kent County. And you can actually see that tension zone right here on the range map. So this is where it's saying that here in the dark green, it's really common, but once you get into the tension zone area, it is infrequent. And then once you get up into the north, into that boreal region, it's pretty much all the way absent. Again, a lot of this is changing, but at this point, it is only change is being facilitated by people. But the great thing about these is they give a brief description, they tell you about the topography, the soils, all those things I listed off earlier are listed in here. And this isn't a direct link, so I can't show you, but if you scroll down, there's actually a list of not only the tree species you'd find in this community, but also the other plants and even the animals that you would find that are common in these areas. So this is an example of our Mesic Southern Forest. And you can see this beech tree here, which is an example. We have a sugar maple here. There's also some tulip trees in here. This is at our Grand Ravines Park. And our understory trees are also in here. We have a lot of musclewood and some witch hazel. And these are all great species that they can handle low light, and they can also handle dry, sandy soils. But more mesic soil. So there has to be a little bit of moisture. So it's not a xeric condition completely. But the shade is what allows it to be more mesic as well. Now, if we got even a little bit more closer to the water, we would even see some pawpaws growing in here. And the great thing about pawpaws is this right here in around the Grand River area is one of the most northern areas that you'll find in the whole United States for this species. And even when you look at it, you can tell that this is a tropical species with not only its fruit, but its leaves all look very tropical. And again, that's because we're in the northern part of its range. Having said that, as we do restoration projects for Ottawa County Parks, we're really looking at the lifespan of these species. And so as we predict that our weather is going to warm, a lot of these species that are on the tension zone are the cold ones, the boreal ones are going to disappear. And they're not going to be able to tolerate our warmer, drier weather. And so we are starting to plant some of these southern species, knowing that these are going to thrive more in the future when we look 30, 100 or more years. And we're really lucky because the USDA Forest Service actually has a model system that you can look up online. I can show you where that is at some point if you're interested. And you can look at the likelihood of a particular species of being here in your location 30 years from now, 50 years from now. So one of the things I forgot to tell you is that I'm testing you a little bit. Some of you might be really good at trees. And so what I thought I would do is I'm putting the pictures up, but I'm not giving you the answer for most of them immediately. So you can look at the picture, see if you can figure it out. I'll be giving you clues along the way. And then at the end, I will show the name of the plant. So again, this was the pawpaw plant, the pawpaw shrub. And this is an example of more of the boreal forest. You're going to have more conifers in there, and you're also going to have these birch. So you have the paper birch. The reason why we have more of these is because these can take advantage of sunlight even when there's really cold weather. And so they can be photosynthesizing even with it does, the paper birch specifically can be photosynthesizing without leaves because they are able to photosynthesize with some of the green on their bark. And the conifers are the same way. If they have a good day, even when it's not ideal, even when it's not the middle of summer, they can start photosynthesizing without having to grow leaves like a deciduous tree would. Okay, so now we know kind of the environment and we know the general communities. Now we're going to look at more at the very nitty-gritty details of how you identify. And the first thing you want to look at is whether or not it is a gymnosperm or an angiosperm. Gymnosperms are ones that are what we call the naked seed, which means that they don't have fruit. They just have these seeds that are not encased in a seed, in a fruit. So these are basically things that are conifers, right? They have cones and the seeds are tucked up inside those scales. Those are really kind of the oldest of our plants or of our tree species. And then we go into our more modern. And by the way, in Michigan, there are several groups of these gymnosperms with these naked seeds, but conifers are really the ones that we have here in Michigan. And then angiosperms are our flowering and our fruiting trees and shrubs. And this is our tulip tree. This is our oldest of our native angiosperms. Magnolias is in the same group. You can tell they have these beautiful showy flowers, quite spectacular. And again, we know that this is obviously not a naked seed because it comes in a nice fruit later on. Even our grasses are considered fruits because they're encased. But these tulip tree, it's funny thing is, I always thought a tulip tree was named because the leaves look like a tulip, but I have been told it's actually because the flower looks like a tulip. So I think the whole thing looks like a tulip. Okay, also along the line, I'm going to just throw in some ones that just don't fit. And there's always going to be those. And I think that they're kind of the easiest ones in a way because you just know they just don't fit. So this is an example of one of those. Most of our gymnosperms, they keep their needles all year long. They'll lose some, like our white pines usually in the fall will leave, I think it's something like 10% of their needles and regrow, but they keep the rest of them so that, again, they can photosynthesize during warmer days. Whereas our deciduous are the ones that are losing those leaves so that they can regrow them again next year. This is our only native our only native gymnosperm that is deciduous. There are a couple, but this is the only native one. This is tamarack or larch. Now, I want to make sure I didn't point this out at the beginning, but I am really focusing in on those species that you're going to find in natural areas, not things that are landscape plants. So there are obviously others like cypress that you are evergreens, but I'm not going to talk about those today. And one of the reasons why is because if you planted it, you know what it is. But here, this is one of those things that when you're out in the woods and you find an evergreen that has no needles, you can put those pieces together and figure out what it is. So, whether it's a gymnosperm or an angiosperm. So now once we have an angiosperm, now we can start breaking it down even more. And the two easiest ways to break down our species, our tree species especially, are by looking at their alternate or if they're opposite. So alternate means that you have one leaf bud or branch, and then you go down the stem, and there is another leaf bud or stem. And versus opposite, which means that the leaf bud or the stem are opposite of each other, like your arms. This is the easiest way to break down between our two groups of our angiosperms. Another way that you can break down our tree species is by looking at whether or not it is compound or if it's simple. Now, it sounds simple, but it's not. Simple means that you have one leaf coming off of a leaf. When you break that leaf off, it's going to leave a leaf scar. A compound leaf, when you break that leaf off, you're going to have the leaf scar up here, and all of a sudden you realize that that leaf is actually one leaf made out of many leaflets, so smaller leaves. So the trouble is oftentimes people are like, well, where's the leaf start to know whether or not it's a compound or a simple? And it really is when you break it off, if there's a scar left behind, then that was the leaf. And so if it's broken up into smaller leaflets, it's compound. If it stays together as one, it's simple. And we'll have some examples of both of these today. Okay, again, there's always the one who's got to be different, right? And so usually when you're looking at a leaf, there's one kind of leaf on a tree. I always recommend when you're looking at not only the arrangement, whether again it's opposite or alternate, or if you're looking at if it's compound or simple, always look at the whole tree, because you could have something strange happen. You could have a branch fall off, and all of a sudden what used to be opposite is now alternate. So you really have to look at the average of that tree. You don't want to look at one specific leaf. But you can also, sometimes when you look at that whole tree, you realize that the leaves aren't the same. They don't all look like our sycamore leaf that was back here, which all look the same on the same tree. Some of them, they look very different. And so there are only two species that are native in Michigan that have this. We call these dimorphic leaves. And it means that there are two different shapes or three different shapes. And so the two that we have here in Michigan are sassafras and mulberries. So on sassafras, you may have heard this one, this is my favorite. This one, you can memorize it, you can teach your kids or your grandkids. The way you know it is that grandma went out to start making a mitten, and you can see this in both sassafras and mulberry. And grandma made one that didn't have any thumbs. And she said, oh no, what am I gonna do? So then she overworked and got overprotective, and then all of a sudden she made one that had 2 thumbs. And that's this one right here. And then finally, the third try, she made one with just 1 thumb. So you can see these 3 different shapes. Obviously, the leaves are very different. The venation on the mulberries are much deeper. There's teeth, or these sharp edges all along on the mulberry that are not on the sassafras. And we have 2 different mulberries in Michigan. We have red mulberry, which is a threatened species, very rare. I love to see if I could ever find one in one of our parks. I have not yet. And then we also have the white mulberry, which is the one you're probably most familiar with, that makes a mess all over your driveway and is also considered an invasive species. The next thing to help you in identifying your plant is this, our mad cat. I love this because it really is the simplest and best way to identify different tree species. When you're looking at the mad cat, you are looking at those tree species that have opposite branching. These are the only trees that have opposite branching. So if you have a plant that's opposite, it has to be one of these. So the first one is mad. We have our maples, ashes, dogwoods, and then we have our cat, which is catalpa. And last but not least, we have horse chestnut. If you have a tree and it is opposite, it has to be one of these. Now there are some shrubs that are opposite, and we'll talk about one in a little bit. So we'll start off with this. You're out and you're looking at your clues. You are in southern Michigan, so you know you're in your temperate deciduous. You are in a wetland. It has mucky soils. And all of a sudden you find this. It is what appears to be a maple leaf. And it's very easy to first know that it's a maple because a lot of people know what maple leaves look like, but it's also opposite. So it has to be maple, ash, dogwood, catalpa, or horse chestnut. So we know that this is now a maple. We look at it, we look at its habitat, and we can quickly figure out that this is a silver maple. Again, if we're talking about plantings, you can put silver maples in dry areas. You can put things in all kinds of weird areas, but if you're looking at a natural environment and you see a maple that looks like this, pretty positive it's going to be a silver maple. Now there are going to be exceptions to it, so you do want to look at other clues like the bark, like the light underleaf. So there are other clues you can look at, but that at least gets you started down the path of identifying and eliminates a lot of other species. This is one that we frequently plant because it does have a wider range. It does have a lot of tolerances that, something that's native might not have. But I mean, this is native, but some other species might have a more narrow range. This is one that is typically, though, found in natural areas in upland. Now, its actual natural habitat is in bogs, so that it's in a wetter area. But when we look at some of our drier upland areas, this is the maple that typically you're going to find. This is the red maple. And again, we often take this one and we will cultivate this and put it out in, not only because of its beautiful showy color in the fall, but also because of its wide tolerances. The funny thing about it, though, is it often hybridizes with sugar maple. So hybridization is the one thing that can throw you off the loop. But typically, if you're in upland, this is what you're going to find. All right, our next one. So maple, ash. So we have opposite branching. Now we have this compound leaf, so we know that it's an ash tree. And then we want to look at habitat. If it's a wet habitat, we only have a few species that it could be. It could be this one here, which is a black ash, Or we could have a green ash or pumpkin ash, which are a lot less common. Unfortunately, the best way to identify these species right now is by looking at if they're dead. Most ash trees right now are, if they're an inch, greater than an inch in diameter at breast height, look like this. And so if you see a stand of dead trees, especially in a floodplain forest that look like this, it's likely you have your ash trees. Again, if you see this and it's an upland area, it's likely going to be white ash. All right, our MAD is maple ash dogwood. Our dogwood, oops, let me go back on that one. Our dogwoods are our opposite tree that everybody loves. Again, I can't wait for a couple weeks from now when we start to see these big, very showy white flowers coming off of this. I know someone was asking about understory trees. This is one that will take mesic or even dry understory shade. Also, it's relative, which happens to be my favorite landscape plant of all times, is pagoda dogwood or alternate leaf dogwood. And that's another one that's opposite, will grow in an understory in shade in dry situations. And one of my favorite reasons for these are not only that they're lovely, they have lovely fall colors, but the fruits are fabulous for wildlife. You can get into some shrubs of dogwoods. Again, almost in every one of my plantings, I put a dogwood shrub. And the reason why is because these berries are full of fat. They're full of lipids, which are really critical for birds when they're in migration. And the great thing about dogwoods is there's such versatility, just like the ashes, just like the maples. There's one for dry areas, like this gray dogwood, and then there are those for wetter areas like silky or our red osier. So no matter what kind of soil you have, no matter what kind of moisture you have the ability to put in a dogwood. Mad cat. Cat is one that is actually not native to Michigan, which is another reason why I didn't do horse chestnut. It's for the same reason. These two are actually planted here in Michigan. Depending on who you are, this is either fortunately or unfortunately, this northern catalpa is now starting to not only survive, but thrive in Michigan. And so one of the things that we have seen is that this landscape tree that is native to southern United States is starting to grow in large numbers throughout some of our natural areas. And one of the reasons why is because we took it out of its native range, brought it here, and at the time it was just surviving outside of its normal climate, outside of its normal range. But now as climate change is happening, we are finding that these are starting to thrive. And unfortunately, unlike the native counterparts, they do not have insect species and other things to keep their populations in check. So we have our oaks that have 530 plus insects that are just lepidoptera or butterflies and moths are keeping those from becoming out of control. Well, this has nothing because we brought the tree here, but we didn't bring the insects that feed upon it and keep it in check. And so we are finding that some of these southern species like catalpa are starting to spread outside of those areas in which we had planted them. But this is our cat in our opposite. It also has world. And so again, this is one of those exceptions that it has opposite like your arms, but sometimes it'll have world where it'll have 3 or more leaflets coming off of one spot. The one last thing about catalpa that is kind of a fun way to identify plants is by looking at their fruit. This one has a very long, beautiful pea pod. And you can look at this leaf and you may know red buds. This looks like a very similar leaf to a red bud. And that's because both of those are in the legume family and they have these long pea pods. Okay, now to our oaks. I'm not going to go into the oaks extensively because there are so many and they hybridize, and I could talk about them all night because they are such an important group. But I think that they are one that is very iconic, and it's really important to understand, just like the maple and the ash and the dogwood, is that there is a range. So we can look at them and break them up into two different categories first. The first are those that are in the red oak group. And the red oak group have points at the end of their sinuses. So this is a sinus right here where the leaf comes in, and then it comes out to a point, a sharp point. Versus the white oak group, which you look at these sinuses and they come to a rounded point. There are many, many trees in the red oak group. My personal favorite is a black oak. And then there are many, many trees in the white oak group. This one is the white oak, I'm sorry, the swamp oak. And you can, besides looking at just the points, another way that distinguishes them is that these red oaks have a lot more tannins in them. And that's a chemical that's in their leaves and in their acorns, etc. And the white oak group has less tannins, and so their acorns are sweeter. So oftentimes when you look, wildlife tend to prefer the white oak, and even Native Americans, early Native Americans, preferred white oak acorns over red oak because they were sweeter. And but again, looking at these, you can look at the habitat of where they're growing. This one, for example, is a pin oak. Pin oaks typically are in moister soils, whereas swamp oaks also are in moister soils. If we go into more upland areas, you might have something that looks very similar to this, but is a white oak. It doesn't have, it is different. It doesn't have a heavier top than bottom. It is more even in its lobing. But the big key really to the difference between swamp oak and white oak is the habitat. And the other, again, is this pin oak versus black oak. Black oak loves dry, sandy soils. So habitat is a really key part of identifying the various oaks. And one last thing, and I forgot to put a picture and I'm mad about it, because my favorite way to identify oaks is by looking at their acorns. Every species has a different fun looking acorn. And by far the best, I think, is the bur oak. It has a wonderful little crazy hat. The little cap has all kinds of crazy looking hairs that come out of it. So acorns are a great way to identify your oak tree. So again, fruit and flowers are great, but again, they're only there certain times of the year. Okay, this fun one. This is where the challenge begins. So you can look at this and it's not opposite. So we're not in the mad cat horse anymore. And it's obviously not a simple leaf, because this right here is where the leaf scar would have been. This is where it broke off from the tree. So this entire thing is one big leaf. This is actually the largest leaf in all of the United States. It can grow up to 2 feet long. And the best part of this leaf is that it is not only compound, it is doubly compound, because, and there's my little arrow. So this is our leaflet. And then this leaflet broke up into leaflets. So this is secondarily compound. And sometimes it can even get to be tertiary compound. So that leaf then can become compound. And so this enormous leaf, if you can figure out where the leaf breaks off, where it begins, is the simplest leaf of all to identify. And yet one of our rarest trees. This is Kentucky coffee tree. This is one, again, that is on the northern part of its range, and Ottawa County Parks is planting this as part of our restoration, knowing that this is going to do better than some of our northern species like hemlocks when we're looking 50 to 100 years from now. And they're just cool trees. Another thing is this is in the pea family as well, so it has a really neat seed, a very large pea pod. Okay, so now we get into some of the little more difficult compound. So you have, this is now into the alternate leaf arrangement. And if you look at this one, you know it's compound, it's alternate, and you might go, what in the world is that? Well, you can, the next clue to this one is the fact that the lower leaflets are actually smaller than the upper leaflets. So the further you go down on that leaf, the bigger the leaflets get. These are the hickories. And then the next one is another one that's alternate, and it can get kind of tricky because just like this hickory, the leaflets are opposite though. And it can grow, there are several different species. They're usually shrubs, which help kind of distinguish from some of the others. But sometimes they can look like a tree, and sometimes they are considered small trees. But this one in particular is pretty easy because you can almost always see this fruiting body. This is the staghorn sumac. It'll also have hairs up here, which gets its name staghorn. But there are other sumacs, like our smooth sumac, our white sumac, and my personal favorite is the shining sumac. But those, specifically the shining sumac and the fragrant sumac, are much smaller in stature as well. And just like the others, there's a wide range of tolerances. Most of them are in drier areas though. Okay, now the tough one. And I will confess, I have mistaken these two. Only once. It only took one time for my soul to be ripped out for me to realize never to make this mistake again. These two look extremely similar, and they grow side by side, which is how I made the mistake. And unfortunately, the best way to identify these two is actually with your nose. And so cutting it is the easiest way to identify it. These two species are tree of heaven, which is an invasive species, and black walnut, which is a wonderful wildlife species. And again, a southern species that is expanding its range. So the way you can identify these through smell is that this black walnut smells like lemon pledge. It smells so good. You just want to eat it right there. Don't. Then the tree of heaven, on the other hand, is stinky. It smells kind of like rancid peanut butter. So don't, you'll smell the difference and you'll go, this one is not good and this one is good pretty quickly. Once you're a little more trained, once you have a little more trained eye, another really good indicator is by looking at the leaflets. And at the base of the leaflet, there are these little knobs with a little gland at the end of each of those leaflets. And you can actually see this even with, at a distance, you can see those little knobs at the end. Black walnut has teeth around its leaflets. So once you actually can tell the difference, it's very easy to see the difference. Okay, so now we got the basics of how to identify. Now I'm going to go into my all-stars. These are my favorite trees to put in when I do any kind of landscaping, whether it's at my house or at one of our parks. And probably the most predominant reason why is for wildlife. These are the things that produce a lot of fruits, but more importantly, these are the things that produce a lot of insects. Again, as Doug Tallamy has taught us, these native plants are so essential for providing food for our specialists, our caterpillars, our wasps, all these different insects. that need these to be able to reproduce. And so you can see this lovely cedar waxwing is sitting right inside of a dogwood with our opposite branching. Again, it's using it as shelter, but in the fall, it'll use this as a food source. So some of my personal favorites, don't judge me because I'm not very good at grooming, but I'm going to start with a couple vines. Vines can get out of control and they will take some maintenance and managing, but this is one of my favorite natives. You have to have both a male and a female because it is dioecious, but this is our Virgin's Bower. And you can see it's got this very interesting seed head in the fall, which is why I love it. Some of you might be rolling your eyes at me right now, but this is definitely one of my favorites. Now, I consider this a weed in my garden. And what is a weed? It's a plant in the wrong place. So in my garden, in my formal landscapes, I pull this out. But it gets there because birds love the berries and it's very good for them. It's full of fat. And so that's the reason why it ends up so often in our landscapes. But I do have this in the back of my yard and it creates this beautiful wall of burgundy in the fall. Unfortunately, you do have to be careful because it often grows with our poison ivy. But the Virginia creeper is really important for that beautiful fall foliage, and it's the host for one of my favorite moths. This is the Pandora sphinx, which is not only beautiful when in its larva stage as a caterpillar, but then also as an adult. So again, without this Virginia creeper, we would not have this beautiful moth. And then there's a group that kind of be a little wild, but they're so important for wildlife and I think so beautiful in our gardens. This is in our natural areas. These are our elderberries. So, let me go back. So this very soon you will see these beautiful flowers. This is in an umbel, kind of like a Queen Anne's lace that comes out in the spring. It is a shrub, so it does have opposite branching. So it's not in that mad cat horse, but it does have opposite branching. And it also has a hollow stem that allows pollinators to overwinter inside. And the common elderberry, again, you can identify largely through habitat, is typically more in our moist areas or our mesic areas. This is the one that you can make wine out of or jelly, and it's just quite lovely. And then in our more upland areas, we have the toxic, the poisonous red elderberry, but still a fabulous plant for wildlife and fabulous for landscaping. And I cannot have a presentation without talking about our service berries. Service berries, also known as shadbush, Amelanchier is its scientific name. These are such not only beautiful spring, these are the sign of spring. They help us know that the ground is thawed so we can have our funeral services. Well, at least in the past, that's what it would tell us. But today they just tell us that spring is here. And so I can't wait for a couple of weeks to be able to see this. But one of the things I love about it is no matter what time of year, it's wonderful. It's beautiful in the spring when it's blooming, but in the winter, it has fabulous winter interest with a beautiful bark. Speaking of bark, this is another one of my favorites called, and you can tell, you can identify it by its bark that looks like a mussel with its deep grooves. And it also has these lovely seeds that come out. The flowers will come out and then the seeds will come out of this. And they just hang so delicately like little lanterns hanging from the tree. And this is, again, a small understory tree that you would find in sandy, dry, shaded areas. This is our musselwood or American hornbeam. I also like the lacy networking of the leaves. And this is one that's pretty difficult if you just look at the leaf to be able to identify. So the bark is very helpful in identification, using all of the clues. All right, now to the troublemakers. These are the ones that are our most problematic woody invasives, because not all of them are ones that we love. But I will say that, again, This particular one that I'm guessing all of you know, it is one that is a weed. There are certain areas like our trails and our parks that we keep this, we pull this, or we will herbicide this. But we leave it at most of our parks because these berries are full of lipids and are great for wildlife. Oh, let me go back. So this is our poison ivy. Poison ivy is very hard to identify. You know, leaves of 3, let it be. Seems pretty simple, but there's a lot of variation amongst those leaves. And so the way I like to identify poison ivy is I look at, not again, this is our leaflet, sorry, this is our leaf. These are our leaflets. The bottom leaflets are opposite of each other. They're mirror images of each other. But the one in the middle looks like you took those two and put them on top of each other. So sometimes those leaflets have really big thumbs. Some of the times they don't have thumbs at all. But the one in the middle usually says the same thing. It'll have either big thumbs or no thumbs at all. So that's one of the easiest ways. People who think they know how to identify poison ivy frequently will not recognize it if it doesn't have this lobing, or if it's not red, or some of the other ways that are their clues. So you have to look for more than just those clues. Another way you can identify if you don't have berries or leaves is by looking at these tendrils. These are the things that are connecting it to the tree. They're very hairy looking. The Virginia creeper, which often grows with it again, actually has a little suction cup at the end that looks like kind of like a little frog's toes. So that one is very easy to identify. If it's hairy, I love saying this with 8th graders, if it hairy rope, do not grope. And it works. If you see that hairy rope, do not touch it. Now, I mentioned this not only as it being problematic because so many of us are allergic to the aerosol that's in it, but also because this is one of the other problems with climate change. So a few years ago, they did a study looking at the effects of climate change on plants. And they wanted to see if invasive species actually had a competitive advantage with climate change. And they took all these different species and they put them in greenhouses and they elevated the carbon dioxide. And what they found is, yes, overall, invasive species were significantly more successful in elevated carbon dioxide levels. But the plant that did better than any of them was poison ivy. And they found in general, vines actually had a different metabolic system. And vines in general actually take advantage of the elevated carbon dioxide levels better than any other group of plants. And so they are able to grow faster and stronger. And that is one of the main reasons why when you look around, a lot of vines like Virgin's Bower that used to be a normal plant is starting to become almost invasive. And it's because these vines are able to do much better with these elevated carbon dioxide levels. So it's just something to consider when we're thinking about how we manage things. Things that used to be in check are no longer in check because of the disturbances. And it's not a disturbance through a backhoe or building in a house. It's a disturbance coming in from the environment. And along those same lines are species like that catalpa, or this is our black locust. Again, native to the US, something that was brought here as a landscape plant. Obviously, it's beautiful. It has these lovely flowers. It's in the pea family. It is a very attractive plant, but unfortunately, as we've brought it here and it's now gone from surviving to thriving, and again, we didn't bring the predators with it. It is now becoming invasive. And so many of us who manage oak savannas or prairies, or some of our ecosystems that are of the greatest conservation need, are in dire threat of this invasive species because it's able to tolerate hot, dry environments and is able to reproduce without the constraints of an herbivore. All right, I only have a few minutes left, and luckily, cut off his head. I'm on my last subject, and those are the threats to our forest and our trees. And unfortunately, we all here in Michigan know too well. We are the poster child of invasive species. And it's only getting scarier for those of us that manage trees. We saw nearly 100% mortality with emerald ash borer. Anything again over an inch in diameter is likely to die. It's about 99.9% of mortality rate. And unfortunately, like so many things, it is the humans that is not only caused the problem, but is also magnifying the problem. And so not only was it crates that brought this into the United States and Michigan, but it was humans taking firewood that was contaminated around the state into other places in the country that's helped spread it even faster than it would have naturally spread on its own. And so a lot of places like Ottawa County parks, state parks are really not allowing people to bring wood in because of the high chance of having that wood being contaminated with, infested with something that is an invasive. Ottawa County Parks, we provide wood for all of our campsites for that reason. Kiln wood is the best wood if you're looking at going camping. Buying kiln treated wood is the best way to prevent having the spread of invasives. Beech bark disease is one that we've had for a while. It is slow spreading. It doesn't have as high a mortality rate, but long term, it has about a 90% mortality rate. It just takes a very long time to get to that point. We here in our Parks Department in Ottawa County, we just had our first infested tree about 4 years ago. So it is spreading slowly, but anyone in Ludington area or north, you know the devastating effects it has on our beech trees. One that unfortunately is becoming a greater and greater problem is oak wilt. Oak wilt is one that is our red oaks family is very susceptible to. And it is one that not only does it affect the immediate tree, but it also affects any tree that is connected to that root system. And that is very problematic because that root system is about the same, if not a little bit larger than the canopy. So anything that could be connected to that around that canopy is then will get this once it's affected after that first year. So this is a serious problem, and it's luckily a very simple problem if people stop pruning trees after March 15th. Luckily, a lot of our tree companies already are very aware of this and they are no longer doing it, but there are a lot of companies like our easement companies that still are doing cuttings. If you're doing it in your own yard or your own area, just make sure after March 15th that you're sealing it off with some kind of latex paint or a tree sealer to make sure that the fungus that causes this doesn't get into that tree. One of our newest ones is hemlock woolly adelgid. This is one, again, it's been in the United States since the 1940s, but it's been contained to the East Coast. And it was contained because there were no hemlock trees basically from the East Coast to Michigan. And it took a contaminated nursery stock to go over that barrier and was introduced into Michigan, whether that was before quarantine or it was someone violating quarantine. But it's here now. It only takes one hemlock woolly adelgid, excuse me, which is an insect. It only takes one of those to make a whole new infestation, and because they reproduce asexually. So you can see all these little white dots are adelgids. If only one of those gets onto, oops, well, let's go forward, gets onto a branch, then onto your camper or your truck or a snow plow or your gas company truck, any of those different things, it can then be transported to a whole new location. So it's very critical that we stop the spread of this by our own cultural practices of trimming branches near roads and near trails and making sure that we have clean vehicles when we go from site to site. This is this is the map. Again, we first detected it in around Holland area. And we have been surveying for it and then having public identify where it is throughout the state. Fortunately, it is so far contained to West Michigan, but this year it did enter a new county and is now up into Mason County. So it is spreading. We are concentrating our efforts on the northernmost boundary because we want to make sure that we prevent it, because again, hemlocks are arboreal species. And so we know with climate change that hemlocks likely won't be able to live long-term in southern Michigan. But hemlocks play an incredibly important component in the UP and in northern Michigan forest. And so we need to make sure that we protect those resources up there. And last but not least, on my last minute, is our newest threat. And we do not have this yet in Michigan, but it is within miles of the Michigan border. This is beech leaf disease, like beech trees needed another disease. And it started again in a nursery down in Ohio and is spreading, and it has again near 100% mortality. And you can see one of the diagnostics is when you look at this up through the light, you have damage to the vascular tissue, so you'll have darker sections. So lots of gloom and doom. I'm sorry I ended the presentation on that, but are there any questions? And I'm going to see if, oh, hey, maybe I can find it. Yay! I found the chat. It took me to the very end.
Well,
do we have time for questions, Sue? I'm sorry, it took so long.
No, we're fine. We do have some questions. I'll feed some to you, and Jenny's going to answer one. So
Okay.
I'll start with you answering some first. Let's see. Verna would like to know about a pawpaw tree. They planted one last year, and the fruit never ripened. So how long does that need to be there to fruit?
That is a great question. Well, there's lots of complicated things with it. So again, if you're on the northern fringe of this, you might not have the pollinator. So the pollinator is very specific. It uses carrion beetles. And so if you don't have that particular species, you might not get pollination. Additionally, they have found that they will not self-pollinate. So if you have one plant all by itself, it's not likely to produce fruit. You have to have multiple species, multiple individuals that are going to be able to pollinate with each other so you can create fruit. And this can be really problematic because a lot of times when you go and you see all these pawpaws and you think, oh my gosh, there's so many of them, they're actually a clone of themselves. And so you can have a very large stand and it's all one species, one individual, and it's not going to produce fruit.
Okay, and I know Verna, she's sending me messages in chat. They planted the tree 15 years ago and they did the pollinating themselves. So I know they were hoping for the fruit to ripen.
Oh, then I don't know on that one.
Sorry, Verna.
Sorry, yeah, sorry.
Verna also wants to know, what is a white mulberry? Does it produce the same fruit or are they white berries?
That is a great question. No, they're the berries that you normally see. When you see all those berries around a mulberry, they're usually like a purplish color. Those are the white mulberries. I will be honest with you, I've never seen a red mulberry. It's that rare. So I'm not exactly sure. In fact, every time I find a mulberry that's out in the middle of a high quality natural area, I have to pull out my book because they are so similar with each other. And every time it ends up being a white mulberry that's been transported by a bird. So I'm still looking for a red mulberry to tell you the difference, and I don't know.
Okay. Colleen would like to know which are deer resistant.
Depends on what part of Michigan you're in, because there's nothing in West Michigan. You know, honestly, we in West Michigan in particular, there are so many areas that just, they'll eat anything. And it's just a matter of what thing they'll eat first. So what I would recommend if you're interested, there are several native nurseries that you can go to. And that is one of the qualities that you will look for is deer resistance. And I can't tell you any off the top of my head. I apologize, just because we just assume everything's gonna likely get eaten.
Yes. Mary would like to know, she said you mentioned a resource for predicting what trees and shrubs will thrive with which climate. Can you repeat that, please?
Yes, it's the USDA Forest Service climate adaptation or climate tree model. And I can, Sue, do you have an email list? If I send that to you, can you disperse it to them?
Yes.
Okay, I'll send it to you afterwards. And because there's a lot of different resources, that's the best one. They even have a bird one on that same website. But we are very lucky in that they also did just do a release one specifically to Michigan, Southern Michigan.
Oh, great.
Had the Northern Michigan one for a while. So if anyone's in Northern Michigan, they've had that one for a while. But Southern Michigan, we've had to lean on Chicago because Chicago had one. And it's nice because it's not only just the climate, it's also looking at other factors like how climate change affect insects and insect damage. So it's more than just like temperature and moisture.
Great. And this will help answer Sharon's question about how do we watch the webinars we missed? What website is used? So Melanie, we will be posting information you provide us, the slides, if you'd like to share those on our website. And we've recorded this and we have information on the michiganmastergardener.org website. Ruth Stillwater has created a page and we'll keep adding to it as we go through the month, but you'll be able to access the webinars there with a password and the information that we're sharing. So we'll post it there. Do we have more questions? Jenny, I think you're on answering Verna's question about muscle wood and ironwood.
Which was,
Verna asked, is muscle wood the same as ironwood?
yes, it's also, Melanie, isn't it also called Blue Beech?
So yes, that's another. And then, so that's why scientific names are so right. It's good. It's Carolinia, I think. And it's related. The other one that's called ironwood, because there are two that are called ironwood, is Astraea virginiana, something like that. Virginia or Virginianum. But they're both called ironwood. So that's where I like musclewood, because that one is very descriptive of the fact that it looks very muscular, but they both have very hard wood, which is why they're both called ironwood.
And I think, let me check the chat. I'm in the Q&A. See what we have in the chat box, if there's.
Ooh, I love this person who talked about the Virginia creeper having an allergic reaction, and she's absolutely right. I learned that 2 years ago. I had a little disagreement with a woman who was like, no, I'm allergic to Virginia creeper. And I was like, you sure? Because so often they grow together, and so often people just love to villainize Virginia creeper for good reason. And then I did my research, and sure enough, there is a very small percentage of people that are allergic to Virginia creeper.
So everyone wear your gloves.
Yes, it's definitely not the same number, even close to the same as poison ivy, but it is definitely, there is a chance.
See, and I learned something else tonight. I did not know that. Thank you,
Verna. And you know me, I'm like, I don't know. But I did my research and she was absolutely correct.
Well, Melanie, this was very informative. We want to thank you so much for providing it. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending and remind you that tomorrow night we have Dan O'Keefe from MSU, and he's with this Michigan Sea Grant. He's going to talk about Great Lake invaders and ecology. There are things that you've probably heard mentioned they've been reported on TV about things invading the Great Lakes from river access. But he's just a wealth of information about so many things that we're not aware of that are happening, that groups are trying to deal with. And I encourage all of you to attend that tomorrow night. It will really be informative. And thank you everyone for attending, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow night. Okay, Vicki.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.